So I want to talk to you today a little bit about measuring culture. In particular, one of the big questions around measuring culture, which is why do you measure culture? So I want to start today by putting up a quote. And I want you just to take a moment to think about if you recognise this quote and you could name the CEO or the company. This quote was on the website of Wells Fargo at the time that 5,000 employees set up 2 million bogus credit and banking accounts that were not approved by customers. Why start a presentation on measurement with this particular quote? Because it's incredibly important that an organisation doesn't get confused between its rhetoric and its reality, the walk and the talk of the organisation. And measurement is a really important way and a key opportunity to bridge the gap between what we say in the organisation and the day-to-day reality of your hundreds or thousands of employees. Before we talk a bit more about measuring culture, let me just bring a definition of culture into the room today. So what do we mean by culture? And it's important to set that as a foundation so you can get a clear measurement of it. Culture is the patterns of behaviour that are encouraged, discouraged and tolerated by people and systems over time. And the really important part here is the patterns of behaviour. And if you think of the Wells Fargo example, what we were talking about there is systematic setting up of bogus accounts. It was patterns of behaviour that weren't particularly customer-centric. Okay, so let's go to our really big question that we want to talk about today. Why do you measure culture? And there are really three main reasons that we measure culture. The first is around understanding what is the culture of your organisation. The second is to get to much more of an insight about what is causing your culture to be the way that it is. And the third is once you're clear on your target culture and you have a plan to implement that, it's about tracking, are you seeing the impact that you want to see? Now, it's really important to be clear on why you want to measure culture because it's about ensuring that you have the right tool for the right outcome. So let's break those down a little and start with understanding. So understanding culture, it really is about three key things. It's about understanding what's healthy and unhealthy in your organisation. It allows you to compare across different parts of your business, and it also allows you to get a number, a metric that you can track over time. Why do organisations measure their culture? For a number of reasons. You might have a problem that you want to solve, but you can't quite put your finger on what the issue is in terms of how people are behaving. The second is with increasing regulation and increasing requirement for board reporting around culture, it's important to have something that is an objective reality of how people behave in your organisation. And thirdly, it's about creating the business case for change. And let me give you an example from a client. We worked with an organisation recently where the executive had spent an enormous amount of time to try and really understand what the target culture needed to be in order to deliver on the strategy. They were really clear and they were really committed on the particular behaviours that were needed. When we did the current culture assessment, what we discovered is that the top two behaviours that they identified in the target culture were the bottom two behaviours in their current culture. Now, I'll always remember the CEO of that organisation saying to me that seeing it in black and white on a piece of paper made it incredibly clear to him how important culture was for his overall business success. Measuring, understanding, and what your culture is helps you to understand and build the business case for change. Now, measuring understanding is done through quantitative assessment. We usually use surveys for this kind of assessment of culture. But it's only one part of the story. So if you're very clear on what your culture is, you also need to then understand what is causing that and why your culture is the way that it is. And when we look at why your culture is the way it is, what you want to do is you have to go deeper. So simply a survey, a quantitative survey is not enough. So we usually, through qualitative assessment, focus groups, and sometimes you can use ethnographic research, You're really trying to get in under the root cause of your business. What are the real values in action? What are the real beliefs in action? How are the linkages between the beliefs, the way people make decisions, the systems you have causing those patterns of behaviour? And if you think about your organisation around the iceberg model, which many of you would be familiar with from working with individuals or your own individual coaching, companies have groups of beliefs, collective beliefs that drive patterns of behaviour. And we've looked at the top of the iceberg, the bit you can see above the surface, using the understanding assessment. But actually what you really need to do is get beneath the waterline and all of those things that aren't necessarily tangible and visible. And the reason this is important is because this is where you need to focus for change. Let me give you an example from a client. So we had an organisation that we were working with. They were striving to be much more customer-centric. They had gone to the marketplace. They had invested enormously in training all their employees to be customer-focused, customer-responsive. Yet after 12 months, their NPS score hadn't shifted. We did a qualitative deep dive assessment with them to really get underneath the iceberg and understand what was causing their challenges as an organisation and why they weren't getting the customer centricity. Now, what we found when we actually went beneath the surface is they had a belief of we know best. And if you think about we know best, it does a couple of things, particularly when you're trying to be customer centric. It means that the organisation was developing products that the customer didn't want. They were delivering it through channels that the customer wasn't interested in. Would it surprise you if I said the organisation wasn't collaborative? Because each of the business units had a belief of we know best, and they didn't feel the need to share information across each other. So by doing this analysis, we were able to really pinpoint what the key issue they had to solve was in order to unlock the culture. Okay, so we have just gone through understanding what is your culture, getting a good sense of diagnosing what is causing your culture to be the way that it is. And the third reason that we measure culture is to track progress once we're really clear what the culture is and you have a plan to implement. So we track culture through three key mechanisms. One is by looking at the impact that your culture efforts are having on the behaviour of people in your organisation. So are they aware of the culture? Are they understanding how it relates to them? Are they engaged and committed in terms of what you're trying to achieve? And importantly, are they starting to observe new behaviours? And what we recommend is that you look at the effect of the work that you're doing on culture on a regular basis, at least monthly, perhaps quarterly, so that you can quickly course correct and adjust your plan so that you can actually impact the culture in a positive way and an ongoing way. Secondly, we look at, are you actually shifting the patterns of behaviour that you intended to shift? And we look at that from an individual and an organisation perspective. So from an individual perspective, measuring your leadership, who should be role models of the culture, is really critical, and you will no doubt be working with them in your first year of culture transformation. So for example, retesting the 360 that they do as part of that transformation might be a really powerful way to get a sense of, are the patterns of behaviour changing? And we find that that's usually a good lead indicator of the change that you're trying to create. At an organisation level, retesting your culture survey. So that baseline metric that you got when you were measuring the what of your culture, retesting that again. And that will give you a very good sense of, are those patterns of behaviour that are critical to our strategy, are they changing? And thirdly, looking at the business outcomes that you're trying to achieve linked to culture. So being really clear on what are those things in terms of our business success that are moving and are they changing. So for example, market share, speed of product to market, net promoter score, as I talked about earlier. Are those key business outcomes linked to your culture shifting? So are you getting the impact that you want? Are those patterns of behaviour changing? And are your business outcomes shifting?